I'm Steve Brule with Studio Brule, and I'm here at the first International Conference on Men's Issues in Detroit, Michigan, with famous Dr. Warren Farrell, author of 8 novels. Is it 8 books now?
Yeah, nonfiction books.
Nonfiction books.
People would consider them fiction, but I consider them nonfiction.
And I guess the book that made you initially most famous was The Myth of Male Power.
Yes, actually, Why Men Are the Way They Are is my best-selling book, but The Myth of Male Power has probably had the most impact, and probably the one that has had the most translation into changing lives has probably been Father and Child Reunion, that got many fathers involved with children that did not otherwise think it was that important for them to be involved.
Okay. And Warren, you were here giving a lecture just maybe minutes ago at this conference. And how did the lecture go, and what was the main thrust point that you wanted to get across to your audience?
Well, how the lecture went seemed to go very well in the sense that it got a very nice standing ovation and stuff. But I'm always suspicious of people that come to me. They're usually the ones that don't like something, don't come to you, and the ones that do say you're wonderful. So I'll leave the evaluation of the presentation to others. But the thrust of it was I was looking, rather than sort of critiquing feminism and saying what was wrong with feminism and where it had gone off its base and made a transition from equality to politics and political considerations. I focused on the 10 major issues that I felt needed to be addressed and why those issues were so important psychologically and in terms of helping people understand what the larger issue was. So, for example, I looked at the boy crisis. And one of the reasons that it's so important to focus on the boy crisis is that boys are doing terribly. They're doing terribly educationally, economically. They're doing terribly in terms of physical health and mental health. And this is happening all around the world. So I explained a little bit of that. But I also explained that boys' issues are so important because, for example, when we talk about a men's issue, say somebody says, I'm a man and I fear rejection when I ask a woman out. Well, what happens for a woman when she hears that is she flips into all the times that a man came on too strongly to her, that overwhelmed her, that manipulated her with drinks. And she has very little empathy for the guy that says, I felt an experience of rejection, because she wants him to hear her experience of being ignored and the insensitivity of so many guys. And so, but when she hears this from a boy's perspective, and she's a mother, and she has a son, and she sees her 15-year-old son being really afraid to call a girl that he's really attracted to, she tends to be saying to herself, she tends to be very protective of him and want him to really feel the importance of not being rejected. And so she suddenly understands these issues from her son's perspective. So in brief, when we discuss adult male issues, adult females are programmed to want protection from men. But when you discuss boys' issues, adult females who are mothers want to protect their sons. So the instinct goes from resistance, because I want protection from a male. I don't fall in love with whining males. I fall in love with alpha males. I fall in love with men who are willing to protect me. I don't want to have a man be talking about, be preoccupied with himself. Men who are preoccupied with themselves and their own feelings are not usually likely to be protectors. And so the reason for the importance of boys' issues is to have people have their protector instinct drawn out, rather than their resistance to men complaining drawn out.
Now, does this continue into adulthood for mothers of their adult sons, or do they make a transition with their sons as their sons become adult males?
It's a really thoughtful question. As boys get older, mothers still have a strong protective instinct to their sons. So if their sons have a divorce, for example, and the woman in their life is really complaining about them, Well, there's part of a mother that will recognize those complaints from her son, but also the complaints about the son are in some ways the complaints about the mother and the parenting. So there's a little bit of protection of the son in relation to I was sort of partially responsible at least for the outcome of the son. But there's another part that she all her life, her oxytocin, her nurturing, cuddle, desire to protect, care for, empathizing hormones are active in relation to her son.
Was this the main thrust of your talk today? And what of your books deals most deeply with this particular issue?
The boy crisis is dealt with largely in the book that I'm going to be publishing in about a year from now, that I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years. It'll be called The Boy Crisis and probably subtitled From Failure to Launch to Mission Accomplished. But so many of the issues that I deal with boys have been are the issues that I dealt with in the myth of male power. But those issues in the myth of male power were expressed from an adult male point of view. And they're also the issues I dealt with in father and child reunion, but they were oftentimes the issues that fathers didn't realize how important their involvement was. And fathers, for the most part, don't realize that their roughhousing, for example, is not just playing games with the kids. It's building alliances with the kids that they can then translate into using that alliance like a coach uses an alliance. And then the child is willing to pay attention to the father, and it doesn't want to rebel so much against the father because the father is the ally of the child. The two of them are playing together. They're defeating. If the father's coaching the child, the father sees the child sees the father as someone who helps him to defeat the enemy. So if the father tries to help the child understand how to defeat the algebra problem or defeat the reading problem or defeat the math or science problem, the child has an already developed experience of the father as an ally and is able to more easily take that in and see the father as a coach. And so those are just a couple of examples that I developed when I did the research for Father and Child Reunion, but they're also things that I'll be helping people understand when I do the Boy Crisis book.
So I'm hearing that you demarcate quite strongly the relationship between mother and son or child and father and son, and I'm understanding that you view the mothers as a nurturing, concerned relationship, protective relationship, and the fathers as a sort of helping the child, the ally, the friend, the mentor, the teacher, helping that child move into the broader world. Would that be accurate?
That's the overall pattern. Now remember, there are many mothers who are more like dads and many dads who are more like moms. And interestingly, when a dad is very protective, oftentimes the mother becomes less protective because sometimes mothers and fathers understand that the children need both. And so they start figuring out what role is most comfortable. But as a rule, a mother, for example, a child will come home from school and say, oh, my teacher is terrible, I hate school and stuff like that. And the mother will be more likely to say, I'm going to go in and make an appointment with the principal and talk with her about getting you or him about getting you another class, another teacher. And the father will say, you have to learn to live with people that aren't very comfortable for you. And it's better you learn it now than you learn it after you get out of the world of work and you get fired. And so, and those tensions are helpful. They're what I call checks and balances. And we all know on some intuitive level that, you may be liberal and hate conservatives or conservative and hate liberals, but you sense on a deep level that the country is probably better because there's a tension between both conservatives and liberals. And a father may hate a mother or vice versa, but the children grow up better when there is that tension between the mom and the dad in the family that leads to the children doing significantly better. We now know that the children do significantly better when they have both father and mother equally involved in non-intact families, when they have when the father and mother live close enough to each other so that the child doesn't have to give up activities with friends or going to a birthday party of a friend in order to see the other parent and build a resentment that they have to go out of town and see the other parent on that weekend and miss the birthday party. And the third thing that children need that I talk about in Father and Child Reunion is that they need to know that they're not here bad-mouthing from mother to dad or dad to mother. And the fourth thing that they need is the parents need to be in family counseling or couples counseling consistently, not just when it's an emergency. When you have those four conditions met, children who grow up in divorce situations or otherwise a non-intact family, those children have a better chance, almost as good a chance as a child growing up in an intact family.
So it sounds to me that you suggested in your message there that this interplay between mother and father, often if a mother is personally not inclined to be a certain characteristic, the father will often take on that characteristic, fill that gap, and vice versa.
Yes.
With the mother. So there's a real dynamic that naturally happens between healthy adults' relationships.
Usually.
To trade off these, what we often talk about feminine ways and masculine ways, but when, of course, an individual is some alchemical mix of all those things.
Exactly.
So people naturally, would you say people naturally tend to adapt to their partner to fill in areas where their partner is not filling in?
Yes, three things happen. One is that female plays protector and male plays stretcher. Let's say, I know you don't already know this, but you're going to try it anyway. You're going to, if you fail, failure is part of success. So that's the normal male-female dynamic. The other one is, we know that a very maybe powerful woman, she might marry a man who's very supportive. And she might translate that into the parenting relationship and sort of be, very boundary enforcement oriented. And then the male sometimes will adapt and sort of be more nurturing in orientation.
Now we're seeing that a lot in society today. At least I've seen it in some of my friends where the woman is more career oriented and the man naturally fills in those roles. But one thing I have noticed as well in a couple of my friends is that the men who take on, say, the motherly role, stay-at-home mother, they've expressed to me some problems with being accepted in that role in the community.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, we should know that when fathers are in a single parent role, or they have a weekend with the children, let's say, and say the child falls on a ski slope and cries. Well, oftentimes, when the woman is right there, the child will go to the mother and the mother will nurture the child. But if the father is there and he's the only one there, oftentimes he will play both a nurturing role, followed by, okay, you can still get up and ski again, now that I've given you a chance to express your feelings. Now, usually the father will let the child express feelings and cry for a shorter period of time, but nevertheless, he does play some dimension of the nurturing role. Now, you have another dynamic in many parents also, which is sometimes there's a dynamic of both the mother and father being overly strict. And then the child will often become a child who's very successful, but there may be a hole in that child's psyche about, I am doing things that my mother and father both want me to do, but there's some part of me that feels I will not be loved, approved of, appreciated, or cared for if I don't fulfill in those things. So you have a child who's successful on the outside, but often insecure on the inside. The worst situation is where both the mother and the father overprotect the children. The child that's overprotected usually does not learn postponed gratification. So the child that's overprotected, that the mother and father says, let's see, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. And then the child tries to get a few ice cream when it's only finished a few peas. And then the child goes, and the mother and father go, oh, we see that you've tried, you've had a few peas. Okay, we'll give you your ice cream. Now, if the mother and father are both that way, if neither one of them enforces boundaries, then you have a child that learns how to manipulate. As I was mentioning in my presentation today, the child learns how to manipulate, maybe prepare himself for being a good lawyer, but he never has a chance to really assert himself and to really be successful in life as a rule.
You were going to say something about the workshop that you had here earlier. Is this something you do regularly, and what was it about?
Yes, I do a few workshops regularly. One is I do a lot of experiential work. I find that people don't hear, when you give people just information, there's only a relatively small period of time from which they can absorb that information and hold on to it accurately. but I did do a fairly lengthy, about an hour slide presentation, PowerPoint presentation. You can tell what era I'm from, slide presentation. PowerPoint presentation.
You and me both.
Yes, right. I did about an hour's PowerPoint presentation on the various dimensions of the boy crisis. So I looked at, why there is a boy crisis and the broadness of it worldwide. I looked at what the causes of it are, and I looked at what solutions might be. And then we broke into groups, and we talked about our dads and what created the glint in our dad's eye. And then I asked everybody in the group to sort of identify that and tell the stories about what allowed them to identify the glint in their dad's eye. And then I asked them to compare what their dad did for a living, like being an engineer, versus maybe the glint in his eye came when he played a musical instrument. But then I asked them to go to their family and make a decision, make believe they were their parents when the first child was born, and decide whether they think the father could make a living as an artist, a musician, writer of poems, player with children, and so on, versus being the engineer. And almost all of them conclude that if the father did what created the glint in his eye, he wouldn't have made enough money to support the family in relation to what he actually did for a living. And so that helps everybody in the family realize that pay is not about power. Pay is about the power you give up, the power you give up of the glint in your eye, the power that you give up to be with your family, the power that you give up to be fulfilled as an artist or a musician, in order to get the ability to have your children have more opportunities in their lives than you've ever had before. And so when everybody realizes that in the room, it not only helps them appreciate their dad, but it also helps them realize that men earn more money not because men have more power. Men earn more money because that they're willing to pay the toll of earning more money, that the road to high pay is a toll road, and that the tolls are paid largely in the family by men in relation to earning, and largely in the tolls of taking care of the children in terms of changing the diapers and taking doing 100 other things with the children. Those tolls are paid largely by women, but both men and women pay those tolls usually pretty happily because they believe that what they do for their children will make their children's lives even better than their lives.
So here, dealing with men's issues, Warren, then we talked about my own father who died on basically at the eve of his retirement after working for 20 years, unhappily to provide for the family, but successfully to recover from bankruptcy. Do you see this in your own father or your own family life or other men that you'd like to share a story?
Yeah, what I see in like my own dad, I remember when he took a job in Europe to run a company, a Dutch company. He didn't speak Dutch, but they felt that he was a good enough manager to move him over there. And so he got involved in a totally different culture, learned Dutch somewhat well, and was respected and mocked by the Dutch workers who saw him as a outside, white male. White wasn't a problem, but American coming in there and sort of trying to run a Dutch company. And so, but he loved it and he loved the challenge of it. But my mother was getting depressed living in Holland. She didn't like the rain. She was she was much more interested in being with Americans than with Dutch women and Dutch men. She didn't feel she had any community, neighborhood support. And she was getting increasingly depressed, and she would cry in front of even me. And I was only 14, 15 at the time. And my father, of course, saw this, and he said, sweetie, if you need to, or if you want to, you move back to the United States, take the children with you, and I'll end my job here. And I will just phase out, give me a couple of months to phase out, and then I'll come back and I'll join you and Warren and your sister, sister Gail and brother Wayne. And so he did this. And 2 months later, he came back, but he didn't have a job. And so he was in his 50s. And so he couldn't find a job anywhere because people were afraid of investing in somebody who was so old and having to pay them pensions when they would only get the last years out of their work life. And so he ended up selling fuller brushes, which is something that if you're younger, you won't know what a fuller brush is. But if you're a little older, you know that fuller brush salespeople walked around the street from door to door with a big case full of brushes. And the only thing they had to sell was brushes. And they were very good brushes, but they were about 3 times what brushes normally cost. And so it was a little bit difficult to get people to buy those brushes.
Very tough job.
Very tough job. And he would make, a fraction of what he made in Europe. And yet to make a living, he said to me one day, Warren, I worked so hard to, climb the ladder, to do things I didn't want to do. I tried to have integrity in going up that ladder. I often lost opportunities because I had that integrity. I then went ahead and I tried to, work with a company that was very challenging to work with. But now I'm coming back and I feel like I've spent all my life so I can walk around block by block selling fuller brushes. But he said, I'm happy to do that because I know if we don't have the money, you won't be able to go to college, and you need to go to college. You're the type of boy that, that you should be making a living with your mind. And your sister, I want her to go to college too, because we don't know how the world's going to be, and maybe she's going to need to have an income. And he had that type of foresight. And to this day, of all the management jobs he had, I respect him more for walking the streets selling fuller brushes than I do for all the management, auditing, accounting, and things that he did at a higher level road, because that's where I really saw that was his way of manifesting love.
That is a beautiful story, Warren. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think this is a story that of my father as well. Mm-hmm. And because even through bankruptcy, he had 7 children, mm-hmm. and worked long hours, had to move to a new country in the U.S. For us, for him, it was the U.S., mm-hmm. And maintain the home back home in Ottawa, and put, at the time of bankruptcy, his 3 children in university, mm-hmm. and still struggled to help with those bills, and paid at least half of mine and a lot of my siblings' university, while living alone in Florida, building houses.
Living alone?
Living alone in Florida,
wow.
Building houses.
Wow.
He started with nothing down there. He got a small loan from a bank, bought up. At the time, you could buy a lot in Florida for $100.
Yes.
And he bought up 20 lots, was building 20 houses at a time. At the same time, he got his real estate agent's license so that he could sell his own house to have more money to pay back. Mm-hmm. He got his real estate brokerage license, so he started his own brokerage, was building 22 houses at a time, living alone while sending.
Wow, that's amazing.
But it killed him.
Yes, exactly. And we really have to share these stories. We really have to know that the world is not like feminists have painted it, that it's a patriarchal world where men dominated women. Men died for women. Women have to know that we love women. We will die for women. Even in my couples communication workshops, the first night, maybe half the couples there, this is the last thing they're going to go to. And if they don't solve their problems there, they're going to divorce their partners. So here's a couples communication workshop with maybe 30 couples. And I asked them, I asked them to write down on a piece of paper that will be seen by nobody. I asked them if your partner is about to drown and you know that she or he is going to drown, but you know that you instinctively feel that you have a 50% chance of dying yourself if you try to save your partner, would you do that? Would you take that 50% risk of dying in order to save your partner? And usually about 97, 96% of the guys say yes. Even this woman, girlfriend that I'm about, or girlfriend that I'm about ready to maybe divorce or break up with, I'm still willing to die for her. Now, about 70% of women say they would die for their male partner as well. And so I use the purpose, that whole thing, not to show that men are more likely to do this for a woman, but it is important for women to understand how, how men don't live their lives to exploit women. We would die to save women. We will die to care for women. If we see somebody, if I saw you raping somebody, I would risk my life to prevent you from raping her. You would do the same thing in reverse. That's what masculinity is about. Masculinity is not about exploitation. When people are sick or have psychological problems they are out of control, then sometimes they deviate from masculinity and they do what is awful to women. And certainly this doesn't, there is rape and there is domestic violence, and it does go from male to female and rape and both ways in domestic violence. So no one should deny that. But that is not the core of what masculinity is about. And to associate a patriarchal world where men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women, nothing could be a greater misinterpretation of what masculinity is about than that type of statement.
Mm. And that is the norm that men will naturally go to if they are raised and grow into a healthy full male.
Yes, if a boy grows up with a dad and a mom, and is a healthy boy, which the great majority of boys with both fathers and mothers are, as long as at least one parent is into boundary enforcement, and another parent or both of them are also into demonstrating a lot of nurturance and caring. If the child has both of those skill sets and both of those attention sets, that child will usually grow up healthy, short of some genetic problem. Then you're going to have a huge likelihood that a boy will be very much oriented toward loving women in a healthy way. When I did an article once for Glamour magazine, I've never spoken about this before, but when I did an article once for Glamour magazine, they asked me to report on what guys most wanted from women when they were sexual with them. And they were expecting all these, tricky sexual positions and orgasms or, other things along those lines that we can all imagine. And I interviewed guy after guy, and these were guys that were not sort of feminist males. These were guys from lots of different stripes in life. And they had lots of different desires, but they had only one thing in common and one thing that was most frequently mentioned. Both what they had in common and what was most frequently mentioned was that they wanted the woman to be happy, excited, gratified. So I submitted this and explained and did the quotes and things like that. And Glamour said, "We can't publish this."
Are you kidding me?
I am not
They would
kidding
not
you.
publish this.
They would not publish it. That was not the answer they wanted.
When was this?
This
Warren?
was back in about the 70s, probably late 70s.
Wow, I would have. When I'm hearing you tell this, I'm thinking, geez, that should be a really important article.
They would love that. I mean, you would think that they would love that. And this is not, Glamour magazine is not a feminist publication, but this is, even.
How do you explain their rejection of this article?
They felt.
How do you feel? Why do you feel?
I feel that their rejection was basically, this is not what our managing editors feel will sell. Women don't really want to hear that this is a very peaceful type of thing. It doesn't sort of like, women want to hear more like, men want a blowjob. Men want, to be, to have it be over quickly.
Is it fair to say that what you found doesn't fit the narrative that's being promoted through the media for the last 30 or 40 years?
Yeah, what I found does not fit the narrative, and it doesn't fit the feminist narrative at all.
At all. No.
And what's happened is that so many editors of so many publications, even publications that like Glamour or Cosmopolitan that appeal to women, they still take this line. The exception to the rule actually has been Cosmo. Cosmo has been more politically incorrect in saying what women really do want, and sometimes that means things like what I just said. But even Glamour magazine, which certainly was not a feminist publication.
Would you retry getting this published?
Gee, that's a good question. If I had any,
I think those results still apply today.
Yes,
They're almost universal results.
I've started 300 men's groups. I've started some 250 women's groups all around the country. And, in men's group after men's group after men's group, I've never heard a man even intimate that and this is, confidential groups where, people open up and share their heart. and know that it will not get outside of the group. And that's the big vow. And I've never heard a man intimate that he really wants to rape a woman. He might want to do a rape fantasy, where the woman says she'd like to be overwhelmed and overcome, and but as long as he knows she's part of the desire,
a willing.
Let's just do a role play like that.
Role play, yeah. But it's a game. It's at that
exactly,
point,
as long as he knows that she knows it's a game, and he knows that she can stop the game at any point in time, just say hold or something like that. Then guys might be into that. But never have I had a guy suggest that he wanted to do something in sex that made the woman unhappy.
Or that the woman didn't want.
That the woman didn't want, exactly.
Right. Yeah. This is fascinating, and it touches on what Senator Cools mentioned yesterday, and she was very passionate in her lecture, and one of the points she made was that women would be surprised or amazed at how much the instinct to protect women is in men.
Mm-hmm. It is such a travesty that feminism has morphed into having a monopoly on sexism to a greater degree than any other institutional monopoly on sexism. When women's studies courses all over the world, industrialized world, preach that that men are really the oppressors and women are the oppressed, and the words oppressed is used again and again in any women's studies course. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just audit a women's studies course at any major university. The better the reputation of the university, the more it will be likely to be oriented toward Marxist feminism. And so, I was on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. I fought for women's rights. I led demonstrations for women's rights. I led demonstrations for the Women's Strike for Equality Day. Whenever there is a shortage of equality toward women, I'm out there wanting to make sure that shortage is ended. But to frame the entire male-female relationship in all of history as men desiring to exploit women, really, it doesn't just miss the mark. It is really a trauma to love.
And Erin talks about this as well, and she actually refers to feminism as the evil empire now.
Yes.
And I don't know when in her life she started to talk along those lines. But it's starting to appear to me, and I've only gotten into these issues since interviewing you a year and a half ago at where the protest that becomes so
infamous,
right? It's a narrative that of men are evil and men oppress through all of history, and it appears to me as if it's a deliberate lie. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's fair to say, if it's deliberate or the people who are spreading this, the feminists, are just maybe not seeing the big picture. Because when even a little bit of history that I've been reading about, that does not fit the big picture of history, of human history.
Yes.
The big picture of history that I've been getting to know more is men sacrificing, men working, men building, men inventing, men providing better lives, men vying for the attentions of women, not oppressing women, but trying to impress women.
Absolutely.
All the time through history. But maybe you could comment on that. Is feminism deliberately distorting history obviously for purposes of gaining some form of public support,
yes,
or are they just not seeing the big picture?
Let's see. I think the best way to put this is, imagine you are a mother and you are taking your child for a walk, but you are a little bit concerned about the danger of bringing that child across the street. So you might exaggerate how dangerous the street is because you feel like the means justifies the end. That lie, that exaggeration is for the protection of your child, to achieve the larger desire for safety. And so I think what happened with a lot of feminists is there was a desire to, it's a lot of means justifies the end. They sort of, they feel that if, that women are not earning equal amounts of money to men. And so therefore, if they want the society to pay attention and to make sure that women earn equal amounts to men. So they look for data that gets society to pay attention. And so the data that is maybe accurate, that maybe some woman in a certain job, got passed over while the men didn't, and she worked longer and harder, and she didn't. They glom on that example to prove that point. And for them, that becomes the metaphor that is the truth. And so when they see other data that disagrees with that, they feel that their larger mission is to get the society to pay men and women equally. They feel that is not happening, and they feel that therefore the lies are justified. And after a while, you don't even begin to see the lies. If I present information that says that women who have never been married out-earn men who have never been married by 17%, and that the pay gap is not about the gap between men and women, but it's about the gap between mothers and fathers, and what happens when fathers increase their focus on work when there are children, and mothers divide their focus between working inside the home and working outside the home. They don't want to hear that because they feel that I'm undermining the bigger picture of what needs to be done, which is to straighten out the injustice for women not being paid equally to men. And once you buy that injustice and you feel like your life is being spent to help people right that injustice, you feel that people like I and my statistics, that they're traitors, they're the enemy of righting that injustice. And so after a while, you begin to excuse the lies that because for you, the means justifies the end. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that feminism came into power at a point in history where we had been through two basic movements, the civil rights movement, and then among intellectuals, most intellectuals who were into gender issues were advocates of Lenin. And Lenin said that family was terrible. The nuclear family was an abomination. It was an invention of the patriarchal system designed to dominate women and to serve men to their own self-interest. And so, and then there was Marxism. And Marx basically said there are oppressors and there are the oppressed. And so the oppressors are the wealthy and the oppressed are the poor or the working class. And so they saw, instead of seeing the working class as being men, they saw the rich as being men and women as being the poor. And so we had two systems that were institutionalized that both had dichotomies between the oppressor and the oppressed. Civil rights, slave owner, and the oppressed black person, and Marxism, the patriarchal dominating system, and the oppressed. And so Marxist feminism, which is what dominates in the universities, fit the men into the oppressor and the women into the oppressed, as opposed to understanding that patriarchy was not the dominating force. The dominating force was the need to survive. And in the need to survive, both men and women did not have privilege. They did not, classes had privilege. Classes had more power. But men and women were in the same class. The rich men had rich wives. They had children that had all the privilege and the power. And poor people had poor husbands, poor wives, and children that didn't have that privilege. So they missed the fact that in any given family, there's both the man and the female, the mother and the father are doing everything they can, sacrificing themselves with the hope that their children will have a better life. And that's what they did to survive. The division of labor, women working or overworking, often to death inside the home, men working or overworking, often to death outside of the home, as a warrior or as a worker. Those things were sacrifices that both parents made. Feminists completely miss that. No, feminists still completely miss that. And the amazing thing is not that feminists miss that. All societies have ideologues who are blind to anything else but their ideology. The main thing is that that ideology has become adopted by virtually the mainstream, and that is and the media in particular, much of the media has moved through women's studies courses, and that portion of the media that has interested itself in gender issues as part of what they write about as journalists, as part of what they write about or do and produce in NPR and PBS. Almost all of the people that write about and produce on these issues have that feminist bent, and it's extremely difficult to present anything that counters that.
That's interesting, because the public then has been conditioned to see this narrative, and the media finds it easier to sell their product if it fits in the narrative that the public is already prepared to receive. And I think a famous Noam Chomsky talks in detail on this phenomenon of the media, right? Mm-hmm. Am I right in that?
Yeah, Noam Chomsky talks exactly about that.
Right.
And but even Noam Chomsky didn't get that NPR and PBS are not selling that many products. They're public, largely public. And what's happened is that the political liberal has bought the belief that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed. That's an outgrowth that Marxist feminism is from the political left, and that has been absorbed by the political liberal. On the other hand, the political conservative feels that the roles, men should be men and women should be women. So they're not interested in a gender liberation movement. They're interested in women becoming real women and feminine women, and men being real men and masculine men. And the masculine men should not question their gender, and the feminine women should be home, whether she's oriented toward wanting to be at home or not. She should learn to be a lady and be at home. And so neither the political left nor the political right are interested very easily in a real gender liberation movement. The political left defines liberation only from the female perspective, and feels that men have no need to ask for rights. It's a little bit like I said in my presentation. Men's rights is, from the political left perspective, like saying the king's rights.
Interesting. Well, Warren, I want to thank you very much for spending this much time with me. Your words and your perspective are invaluable, not just to men's rights, but to human rights and to our society and culture in general.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge you, Steve, for you listen to me talk, you work the camera, but you at the same time are always thinking about what are some thoughtful dimensions of my question that lead me to taking it to a deeper level for your viewers, and that's real service to your viewers.
Well, thank you very much, Warren. I appreciate that.